of the flow, there's going to be a bit of a change of the flow. Not necessarily a bad change. We're going to start with concrete experiences of displacement, a presentation of case studies from South Asia from our colleague Sanjay.
Thank you, Lady. Thank you, Rezabai. I was not prepared to be first speaker, but let me try to make my first presentation a bit more interesting in terms of a research work that we have been doing. Can South Asia Action Aid International in South Asian countries. We are working in 4 countries, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and India, where climate impacts are visible. And while climate impacts are visible, the ripple effect of climate impact is not known much so far. Climate change is really devastating lives and livelihoods of millions in South Asia, and we have seen that with direct impact visible during floods and drought. While there is a push factor of conflict, poverty, land access, and ethnicity, there is also a pull factor of development, livelihoods, seasonal labor, kinship, access to health, education services. So what we are talking about here, and the study that we are doing, is looking at climate change as a push factor. People migrating for bright opportunity is one thing, but people migrating due to stress, due to failure of their livelihoods is one aspect that we need to study on. Climate change is still largely invisible in debates in South Asia, though we are talking about mitigation, we are talking about adaptation also, but what is the impact on social composition is something that is still missing. And that's the key aspect of our study. And why South Asia? Because climate change impacts are being felt irrespective of boundaries. And on top of it, we share natural resources in the region. Our rivers, we share mountains, we share oceans, we share most of the ecosystems that support lives in South Asian region. There have been numerous instances of droughts in last 1 year. Before that also, there's been a huge drought in India this time. Also in Pakistan and Bangladesh also faced drought, flood situation, and in fact, a unique phenomena of facing disasters simultaneously. And that has really added a lot of stress on, or that has really tested the capability of disaster risk reduction practitioners in South Asian countries. Excess water and scarce water flow in rivers is also a bigger issue, because rivers crosses boundaries and there are tensions between countries because of excess water in monsoon period and less water in down river sides in countries, and that's the biggest stress that we are facing. In light of all these climate impact, there are 4 kind of migration pattern that has been noticed. One, temporary displacement. We did a study in Chhattisgarh, which is central India, where farmers were migrating to work in brickling in down south Kerala because of a few months of no water and no possibility of cultivating agriculture crops. And on top of it, if this temporary migration is happening one after another, then they have very least capacity to revive their assets, and that leads to that actually puts them into a situation where they need to migrate permanently. There is also a slow onset phenomena which has reduced the yield of agriculture. Anyhow, South Asian countries, we have majority of small and marginal farmers, and there is a subsistence agriculture still being practiced. Basically, subsistence agriculture means they grow and they consume by themselves. Any surplus, they sell it in the market. And agriculture has actually become a very unviable livelihood option for them. And that is also another stress which leads towards migration. In terms of pattern, as I already said, temporary migration for work due to disasters or due to disasters. Internal migration is happening within cities from one city to another. Transboundary migration is happening, especially towards India. And then there is an external migration, mostly in Middle East. So these are the four kind of migration trend we have observed. What is the impact of women? Young female migrating to abuse and trafficking is one impact that has been noticed. There is an increased number of women-headed households. There are villages in Nepal where whole village do not have a man of working age. So those kind of impacts has been observed. There's a burden on women, feminization of agriculture. They take care of households and child responsibilities and also husband's role in agriculture. There is disaster. Whenever there's a disaster that has happened, this was noticed when the Nepal earthquake came, that when disaster struck, there was hardly any men to get into a relief work and save the community, and that kind of impact has also been seen. Tensions and intolerance are growing in India, in South Asia. In India, we have seen, and same may be the case in other countries also, but prominently in India, we have seen politically it's a very big issue. There are nationalist movements who are really trying to mobilize votes, which is a very wrong trend. And intolerance is also growing in South Asian countries. At the end, I would like to conclude by saying that climate change impacts are invisible, but they are driving migration. They are driving small, poor, vulnerable people very close to the poverty line towards migration. Impact of women is severe, that needs to be addressed. There's a lack of recognition of migrants, and there's no protection of rights. They are completely cut off from the place they migrate. They're being pushed away for problems they are not responsible for. So all the blame comes on them. And thus we need system of safe migration and protection. Warsaw International Mechanism is a place that should recognize migration as loss and damage. And most important, there need to be a mechanism in place at the regional level for effective coordination to receive migrants with sympathy rather than with hatred. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you.
Sanjay tried to depict the issue of climate displacement from the South Asia. Now I will go to invite Rita Waka, Friends of the East Africa, for deliberation. But before that, I want to mention one thing, that since Copenhagen COP, we are organizing such an event to popularize the issue. And on all those events, we have been supported by different organizations, especially to the coast. The name of this organization are Action La Fame, ACT Alliance, Asia Pacific Refugee Right Network, Asia Pacific Women for Law and Development, Asia Pacific Research Network, Christian Aid, Bangladesh Paribesh Andolon, Bangladesh Indigenous Network for Climate Change and Biodiversity, Bangladesh Climate Change Journalist Forum, Campaign for Sustainable Rural Livelihood, Climate Change and Development Forum, Forum for Environmental Journalists in Bangladesh, and LDC Watch, Equity and Justice Working Group, South Asia Alliance for Poverty Eradication, Jubilee South America, Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, Coastal Development Partnership, Beyond Copenhagen Collective, and Paribi from India. I hope that their support will be continued. So Rita, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Rita Waka. I work with Environmental Rights Action Friends of the Earth Nigeria, and I'm the coordinator for Forest and Biodiversity for Friends of the Earth Africa. I'll be speaking on a very sensitive subject which has not gained a lot of attention. Climate-induced displacement in Africa. There is a strong connection between climate change and displacement. But the fact is that Africans remain the best custodians of natural resources, but yet they are the most impacted by climate change. And what are the causes? The major causes of climate change displacement in Africa: one is sea level rise, Africa has a large and growing coastal population, and that includes a number of important coastal cities. But with the increased sea level rise, flooding and inundation of coastal areas would be expected to create more problems in these coastal areas, which has led to displacement of communities, affecting agricultural activities, and also issues that has to do with water resources within the coastal zone. And being that the coastal zone is bounded in the west by the Atlantic Ocean and in the east by the Indian Ocean and in the north by the Mediterranean Sea, it is pertinent to put this issue into focus. For example, the sea level rise has caused forced migration in communities in Togo, where the Anelo district in that area is being forced to migrate to other parts of the country and even outside the country. And the effect is a loss of wetlands, including mangroves, increased rates of beach erosion, which of course has promoted large-scale displacement of people and communities. Another cause is land grabbing. There seems to be an influx of transnational companies coming into African territories to grab land in the name of structural development, in the name of trying to create agro-business, which is flourishing in Africa. They use that, they grab lands, communal land, forested land mass, and that causes a lot of displacement in different communities across Africa. And I'll give an example, like we have transnational companies coming from Europe and Asia and other developed countries in America. And they involve in cultivation of agro-commodities like oil palm. They use it for agroforests to fuel machines. And communities that play host to these companies are left at their own mercy. They are displaced, and this is very serious, cause a lot of serious environmental impact on them and also social. In Nigeria, over 400,000 hectares of land is taken away annually. And this is a very sad development. And this is causing serious migration, forced migration of people, especially in the rural areas. The issue of fossil fuel extraction, cases of oil spill, pollution of farmland, fish ponds, and forest areas, especially in the mangroves, is also forcing communities and the people dependent on these resources for survival to move to areas that they did not plan for. And in Nigeria, for example, the Niger Delta region is a case study where over 200,000 people are being displaced from their homes. And this pattern of migration has also cut away from the internal displacement that is being experienced, not just within the Niger Delta states, but also outside the Niger Delta states. So this influx of migration to other parts, it's a worrisome development. Another key issue in Africa that we need to be worried about is the shrinking Lake Chad, which has led to displacement of millions of people. And this is as a result of the water scarcity. In the 80s, the Lake Chad used to, it shrunk from 25,000 square kilometers, and right now it's less than 2,000 square kilometers. This is very disturbing, and this is what serves as a source of livelihood to a lot of millions of communities and countries, being that Lake Chad is bordered by 4 countries in Africa. You have Cameroon, you have Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. So this is a dramatic impact. The shrinking of the Lake Chad, disappearance of the water body has led to displacement of communities in that region. Domestic use and commercial benefits of the Lake Chad is now a threat. Then we also have issues of overgrazing the surrounding lake, and the subsequent decline in vegetation has caused extensive desertification. And this has forced pastoralists to move from the northern part to other regions. and this is fueling conflicts, especially in the Middle Belt and some other parts of the southern part of Africa and southern parts of Nigeria. And this is an issue that even till now, more people are being displaced and more eviction cases are looming. Then this has also contributed to insecurity rates in parts of the region, because these people who used to depend on the resource from the Lake Chad can no longer, sustain their livelihood means. So with the advent of the terrorist group called Boko Haram in Africa, this has caused the recruitment of young people into this terrorist group. And this is as a result of climate change, is linked to it. Another issue is drought and desertification. The Inseguro district of Uganda is currently undergoing severe drought, and this has led to displacement of people to neighboring countries in Tanzania and Rwanda. If you look at, there's a flood and displacement chart, which I have here. Torrential rainfall and flash floods has resulted in massive displacement in communities across Africa, in Nigeria, and in Uganda, in Mozambique, and this has also forced migration to other areas. For example, in 2012, about 6 million people were displaced in Nigeria, with 300 people dead. And in 2014 to January 2015, Mozambique experienced about 160,000 people affected by flood, and 65,000 hectares of crops were washed away, with 158 deaths recorded. And that is not all. In 2016, also April this year, in Angola, about 19 deaths were recorded, with 800 families displaced as a result of flood. So it is real. Also in Niger, 11 deaths, 1,693,000 homes were destroyed as a result of flood. The effect of forced migration and displacement in Africa is real. There's cultural shock, cultural dislocation affecting norms and traditions of the people, and increased inequality rate has increased as policies and practices of government does not favor these migrants. Evictions and extinction of communities, spiritual contamination, livelihood truncation, hunger and starvation. We also have issues of sexual abuse against women, families, girls and children in internally displaced camps, harassed sexually. We have cases like that by security agencies who are supposed to protect these people at their camps. And the results of such rapid and unregulated internal displacement could potentially be serious in terms of social tension and conflict. Migrants are most often treated as lesser beings, as intruders, and they are marginalized. Social exclusion and discrimination is one of the issues they face. And they suffer lack of access to health care. In Africa, more cases of children dropping out of school as a result of displacement from climate change is looming. And this restricted access to land and water, militarization of community territories where displaced camps exist. And one of the way forward is that government must commit to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees, and there must be concise effort to really tackle the true cause and the true cause of climate change. Tackle the real causes of climate change instead of embracing false solutions that is market-driven. I think I'll have to stop here now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Sanjay has depicted the issues from the South Asia, and Rita has given the example for Congo, Nigeria, and she has also included the issues of how people being displaced because of the development paradigms and so-called development paradigms in Africa. So now I will request Harjeet. Harjeet, he will tell more about from the discourse of loss and damage and WASH, so implementation mechanism, After that, I will request Benjamin Schitzler. He's one of our friends and supporting our movement since long time. And after Harjit, he's from United Nations Human Rights Office. He's the human rights officer related to climate change environment. So Benjamin, you will be ready. Stand by after Harjit.
Thank you. So while we are here to talk about climate impacts, we have some impact of the ongoing negotiations. So I've just been informed that a couple of colleagues who were supposed to be here are stuck in negotiations, and certain things are getting complex on issues, so they can't really come out of that. So what we are going to do is to minimize the loss and damage that we would have occurred by chipping in and do some kind of local adaptation. Let's see how far we succeed. My name is Harjit Singh, and I work with ActionAid as Global Lead on Climate Change. Sanjay talked about the study that we are doing collectively in the South Asian region. My role here is to talk more about what is happening at UNFCCC, particularly related to Warsaw International Mechanism, the issue that have been following for the last several years. But before I go there, let me highlight why we are talking of displacement. Yes, Lydie and colleagues talked about the challenges. In fact, it's good that we started with hearing concerns straight from the field from Africa and South Asia, both very vulnerable to climate change. Displacement to me signifies that our local coping mechanisms have failed completely. None of us would like to leave our homes and families and stay away unless and until you find that there is no other option left. And that's why it's extremely important for us to work on an issue like displacement, which means that people who are leaving their homes are desperate and they need to be supported first. So when we talk about impacts, working on the issue of displacement has to be our top priority. Somehow we don't find that in negotiations. We fail to remember the ultimate objective of Paris Agreement, or going back to convention. It's about people, it's about ecosystem, it's about planet. And we tend to forget that, and we tend to get stuck in the technical negotiations where we only talk about fossil fuels and solar panels and wind farms and not much about people. So when we put displacement at the center, it means we are actually putting issues of people at the center. And that's a very important point for us to ponder when we come here, because in these halls and lights, probably we tend to forget who we are fighting for. So we need to continuously remind ourselves. The work that we have in front of us is humongous, because the impacts that we are seeing, we coming from developing countries are seeing those impacts day in and day out. Whereas discussions here at international level are stuck with terminologies. It's an important discussion. If you track different terminologies that have been used in climate negotiations, displacement, migration or forced migration, human mobility, there are a number of terminologies. And I don't deny that at the academic level, we need to understand the definitions. So on one hand, when the work on the ground is ongoing and needs to be scaled up, we need to sort out these definitions very, very quickly so that we move towards action. And that's where you also keep hearing a word called climate refugees. So I'm just highlighting the important piece of work that we need to do in the next few months and not years. Second, the reason all of us have come together is to put a spotlight on the issue of protection. That people who are leaving their homes because their local coping mechanisms have failed, they need to be protected. And that protection agenda needs to be understood and applied at all different levels. And when you look at the text here, it talks about national, regional, and international levels, which means we need to really be cognizant of the mechanism and how it's going to play out at all different levels. And the work that we are doing, and that's why the South Asian study is going to go deeply into that subject of what kind of regional systems that we need to be looking, protection system that we need to be looking into, or probably developing from the scratch. And as Sanjay was highlighting, where you have shared ecosystem of various kinds, you can't just look at political boundaries. You have to move beyond political boundaries. And the term that we keep hearing about, ecosystem-based adaptation, I would say ecosystem-based solutions and ecosystem-based protection systems that we need to we need to be looking into. I'm not going to create a new acronym here. That's not the purpose. But just to say that we need to look at the dependence on ecosystem and how people move, because their livelihoods are dependent on the same ecosystem. Coming to UNFCCC, just to give you a bit of background, the first time when we had official recognition of some issues much more seriously, it was way back in 2010 at Cancun, when we agreed, let me not get into the 1CP16 and all that, but we agreed to that we need measures to enhance understanding, coordination, and cooperation with regard to climate change induced displacement, migration, and we had another term there, and planned relocation. Again, as Sanjay was highlighting, there are different kinds of migration or displacement that we are seeing. Some are temporary, semi-permanent, and in some cases where we have islands sinking or a land being inundated forever, there you have to look into the issues of planned relocation. And it also talks about working at different levels, national, regional, and international level. We kept discussing, and then in 2012 at Doha, where, as you know, loss and damage was a very important issue, and that's where we agreed to have Warsaw International Mechanism. Again, it was agreed that impacts of climate change are affecting patterns of migration, displacement, and that's where human mobility term came in. And it was decided that we need to enhance our own understanding on this particular issue. And that's how it became part of the Warsaw International Mechanism work plan. Some of you who may not be very much aware of Warsaw International Mechanism, it was agreed in 2012 to have that mechanism. It was established in 2013. And in 2014, an initial work plan was developed, which had several areas of work and displacement and migration and human mobility. That phrase was there as one of the work areas. Discussions continued, and in Paris Agreement, again, it was highlighted that since this agreement is going to stay for several years, it's important to have this language very much there in Paris Agreement. We couldn't succeed in having displacement language in main Paris Agreement, but as part of the package of Paris decision, it was agreed that we need to be setting up a task force, and that task force will be coming up with, of course, in coordination with several bodies and several organizations working on this issue, and some of these organizations are well represented here, to work with them, talk to different governments, and develop recommendations for integrated approaches. And then there are three terms which are important to understand: to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse impacts of climate change. So in a way, there's a broad agenda mandate that has been given to the task force on displacement. Now, the executive committee to Warsaw International Mechanism has been working on it. There are 3 meetings this year, 1 meeting way back in 2015, September. And in these meetings, because the new agenda that came from Paris, that was included as part of their work plan, and a task force, after quite a bit of discussion, a TOR has been agreed that what this task force would be working on. And task force has been established in one way, I would say, because it was agreed we are going to have maximum 12 members, and 4 members would come from the executive committee itself. And these members are represented by United States, Austria, Tuvalu, and Senegal. We are likely to have Mr. Idi from Senegal, who is a member of Task Force on Displacement, to come here and share more details. Again, he is in the negotiation, so I hope he finds time to come here. In terms of scope of work, the idea is that task force would be looking into latest science. Some of us who have been attending all these meetings have highlighted that you need to look at displacement in a more dynamic manner, because temperature continues to rise. We've already crossed 400 parts per million of carbon levels. So how we should be looking at displacement considering latest science and impact scenarios. And it doesn't really say impact scenarios, but it does say most recent evidence, findings, and experience. So it's going to do that kind of research, and at the same time look at different approaches, again those 3 words, to avert, minimize, and address displacement. And also looking at approaches that are going to work at subnational level, national, regional, and international level. And the work that we are doing is actually to feed into these kind of processes. The task force will also provide opportunities to countries and organizations, institutions working on this issue so that we can learn from their experiences. Again, as I said, some of these organizations are here and we'll hear more about their experience. And particularly looking at the legal and institutional challenges. And this task force is supposed to complete its work in the next 2 years. And they will, hopefully other 8 members will be recruited in the next couple of months so that they can start their work as soon as possible. And they are supposed to submit their report to the executive committee. And again, we have worked with the executive committee to ensure that there is some continuity of the task force to also help implement these recommendations and not just stop at the recommendations. So that engagement is going to continue. There's a lot more happening outside Warsaw International Mechanism. So I'm sure we are going to be hearing more from Nina and others on that. So just a snapshot. In short, I would say that Warsaw International Mechanism, the executive committee, has worked diligently over the last 1 year, keeping many toxic things behind and moving forward constructively. But the progress has been pretty slow when you compare it with the challenges we are facing from the ground, what we have heard from Africa and Asia. So my urge would be that we need to really scale up this work and scale up and speed up this work so that we can respond to the challenges on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Harjeet, for giving elaboration on the state of play in the loss and damage discourse and WASH implementation mechanism. So now I will go to Nina from Norwegian Refugee Council. He will describe more about what is happening outside the UNFCCC process. So Nina.
Thank you. I'll not describe everything going outside the loss and damage and WIM, but I'd like to start with that in the UNFCCC process, of course, displacement, human mobility is not just that loss and damage issue. As we all heard, this is the phase of climate change. So it belongs all over the UNFCCC process. But of course, now with the task force, it will be an extra push, but don't limit it there, take it all over. When we look at these issues, many of us, whether we are NGOs, think tanks, academics, UN, international organizations, as Reza said, there has been a push for at least 10 years or more to try to get this issue into the policy agenda, because it's not something for the future. It's already gone on for many years. So I think over this period, we've been able to recognize that climate-induced displacement is happening. And we already know with the information we have that it's much larger than conflict-induced displacement. So it's just going to go one way unless we take dramatic steps. When we talk about the various processes, there are 3 I wanted to mention outside the UNFCCC. Maybe I should list some of the others too, because of course I could have easily talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. I could have talked about the World Humanitarian Summit, but I'll focus on Sendai. I will say a few words about the global compacts and the big UN General Assembly discussion in September. And I will say something about a non-UN process, the Platform on Disaster Displacement. They're also here, so they will talk more after. When we look at these processes, those of us who come from kind of displacement, human mobility, migration, we very much want this to be an issue that is picked up by all processes, because we think you can't really set up something completely new. You need to integrate it in what's going on. So in the same way as we are very happy that we got it into the UNFCCC in Paris, we also got it into other processes last year. So Sendai, there is several mentions of displacement. So again, how do we make this from words to action? And this is something that I know many here are contributing to, but I think those of us who are working in various, how do you make sure that our colleagues, friends who maybe are more active in another process also pick this up, so we're not just try to think that UNFCCC will solve this alone. Global compacts. In mid-September, there were meetings in at the UN General Assembly in New York, and this is the first time in decades actually that the UN put at that very high level displacement and mass migration on the agenda. And there are 2 processes now on coming up with global compacts on refugees. And then that's linked to the Refugee Convention, and UNHCR is here, so they can probably say more about that if there are questions. And it's linked to migration. What we have seen in this is that climate change and the displacement we talk about at this panel isn't very much integrated in this compacts as of now. So again, how can we try to get it more into there? Maybe not a lot in the words, but in the actions coming out of this. Finally, platform on disaster displacement. That's a non-UN process. And I have to say from an NGO perspective, they have been very, very successful in bringing things forward quickly. And yes, UN is important, but we also see here how a UN process often is relatively slow. And states have taken a responsibility through the PDD, the Platform Disaster Displacement, and pushed this forward. And you have more than 100 states who have signed on to these issues during that. Also in that process, they were very good at having a process where they included us in civil society to also be part of shaping this. So all the regional consultations, also civil society, were included. And I think this is maybe also linked to how that process actually is so successful. Atle Solberg will probably say more about that after, but here I think what is important, use ways of working that creates the results. Don't forget the big processes, but don't think the big processes will always solve the problem in time. Thank you.
So we are about to having deliberation from the presentation panel. Now we have the from Ajep Girbi from LDC Watch, Friends of the Earth. She's from Ethiopia. Ajep, please.
Hello everyone. I'm sorry, I just arrived and I'm a little bit scattered, but I will say a few points. Most of my colleagues have touched on the area in detail, but I just wanted to say a few things on the political legal aspects and the practice that's happening. And I will be speaking or reflecting this on behalf of the people from the LDCs and SEEDs, which are the most vulnerable in terms of the effects of climate change as we know it. And I just wanted to say that the climate-induced displaced people, in most cases, as a people that are actually facing the impacts of climate change, have not been recognized as such. We know that climate change is mostly associated with their livelihoods, the biodiversity, food security, water shortages, disaster, the desertification of these countries. And because of that, people being affected, but we don't politically, even in the discussions, it's not recognized. The people themselves displaced, leaving their homes, their families, disrupting the nucleus of the family itself, mostly losing families, losing their labor, mostly creating female-headed households at home, families, farmers in the slow onset disasters, as we say in Africa. Families are diminishing because fathers are leaving for a long term or a short term as a coping mechanism, and we lose families within the communities, mothers with their children not being able to cope, to feed their families, apart from the effects that the environment is being affected. So this suffering has not been recognized as the people who are also migrating, who are looking for work, which are not protected, as I will look in the legal framework. These people are out of the legal protection because the term in the 1951 convention over only a small set of people are protected in this, and these are people who are persecuted as persons who, owing to a wealth mostly away from their countries, afraid for persecution of religion, or political refugees, but never a huge number of people who are migrating from their homes, from their families, due to the climate change, are not recognized or covered by this legal framework that is an international law. So they are not given the refugee status as such, because they don't fall into that particular international law. But in practice, as I said, the area of refugees as we know it, because it's not covering the number of families that are moving in Africa or Asia and in other parts of the world, these communities are still suffering, particularly in Asia, in Africa. They have not received that level of protection. In the UNFCCC framework, this discussion has been here and there, some elements that have been pointed out. The first mention is in the Cancun Agreement, section, paragraph 14, section F, where it has recognized in a way that the climate displaced communities, that the UNFCCC has to provide research, coordination, and cooperation. The second recognition is in the Doha COP18, which says how impact of climate change are affecting patterns of migration, displacement, and human mobility. These are the only discussion within the UNFCCC, although it's not explicit, which doesn't have anything that says to protect climate displaced communities, but at least it recognizes and it gives room for discussion for later. But these two elements have been diluted in the Paris Agreement. It doesn't explicitly pick those already started discussions. It doesn't elaborate, but it doesn't give any reference in the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement only picks up the Article 18, which is anchoring the Warsaw International Mechanism, but still again, it doesn't have any clear direction in relation to climate refugees. Except the anchoring of the loss and damage mechanism. What we are calling for now is that the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is anchored in the Paris Agreement, to take further the discussion of climate refugees, so that it creates a task force within the WIM, so that it takes us to the long-term goal, where in some ways we have a similar kind of protocol, which is like the 1951 refugee protocol, which I said earlier, which has a very good protection for refugees as refugees, but the climate displaced communities will require similar protection. I don't know what kind of framework it will have, but that is the goal, where we are calling the opening of Article 8, where it discusses on the WIM, will facilitate the creation of a task force to take us towards achieving the goal, where, as I said, a protocol or communities to have that protection that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azeb. We're going to move on to the second part of our program, and this is where we're going to hear from different governments and intergovernmental agencies and institutions about how the problem of climate-induced displacement is being addressed, or what their ideas are or plans are for addressing this problem. So we're very honored that our first speaker has time to join us this afternoon. He is Dr. Kamaluddin Ahmed, did I pronounce that right? Who is the Secretary of the Ministry of Environment and Forest in Bangladesh, one of the countries that is facing serious problems of climate-induced displacement, especially in the coastal areas. Dr. Kamal.
You want me to review them also? Review what they've said. Okay. Thank you, co-chairs. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We have heard a good number of panelists and from different perspectives, from different point of view, they have brought in very important issues. We all know that this is a big concern on our part at the moment, climate-induced displacement. Definitely, it is in all vulnerable countries, it is there, and it is therefore a matter of great concern, as I have already said. Some of the very important things some of our panelists have uttered, I would specifically like to quote, like local coping mechanisms have failed, as has been said by Harjit. It is true that those people who have to leave this place, as we call it, a forced migration, they cannot really cope with the local situation. Then there have been saying like tensions growing everywhere, driving migration, lack of recognition of this migration. And Ajay has said that this has not been recognized, especially when Refugee International Convention has recognized it. The climate migrants have not been recognized, although Cancun Agreement brought in some very good developments, but later, according to her, Paris Agreement hasn't really been able to address that. There are other things like African countries where we have seen things like lack of lake charge, serious environmental impacts on people, especially rural poor, excessive desertification, those things. Over and above, ladies and gentlemen, we can say that these are true. There are truths in various places about climate migration, and so long we can hear that temperature is rising, and there is unless there is a hope that temperature will reduce, we cannot say that we will have a better future. So in that case, future scenario of climate-induced migration is rather a bleak scenario, and we have to remain prepared for something to do for this. What can we do about this? I have been asked to tell about developing countries situation, especially in our country. We do have such serious scenario in our country. Although there is a dynamic leadership and food food production has increased to a great extent because of the fact that it's a deltaic country having high amount of our highly fertile land, because of proper utilization of that land, because of the various regular efforts, concerted efforts taken by the government. Still we are in a position to produce a lot and make it possible on our people to take food regularly and also to export some amount. But with the passage of time, if the temperature doesn't reduce, what will happen? We will not probably be able to cope with this situation. In Bangladesh, we have about 39 million people living in the coastal area, which is a huge amount, which is about 1/3 of the total country's population. And I can say that many countries in the world, about 80 countries, almost 80 countries in the world, do not have such a big population, the whole country. But in coastal area, people who are living in fragile environment, they are really at risk. And these people, while at risk, when there is climatic extremity because of climate change, because of cyclones, tidal bore, we understand that salinity intrusion take place quite often, and because of salinity intrusion, the agricultural land get affected, and also because of hurricane, when huge amount of sand cover cultivable lands, there also they face serious consequence. In some places, we have seen that about 100-kilometer area has already been, in some places, the climatic extremity has effects on about 100-kilometer area. And we have our pride, the Great Sundarban, the largest mangrove forest in the world, which is also the abode of Royal Bengal tiger. It is not only that, it really serves huge number of people in the coastal area. People depend on Sundarbans for their livelihood. Now, this number of people, while they are affected, what can we really do? That is a big question. Quite often we see that people put responsibility on the government, and the government, whether take it properly or not, that is the main question. In our country, we have been trying seriously to address this. The government of Bangladesh has taken efforts, not only depending on the international support. We have created our climate change trust from our own fund. We have been supporting our people to strengthen their capacity so that they can stand on their foot, they can face adverse impact of climate change through proper adaptation. And apart from that, we are definitely trying to keep our liaison with the international support, and we are also getting supports in various ways. But of course, at the moment, we need to address these particular migration or climate-induced displacement. We have to avoid, minimize, and address this displacement. For that matter, what we consider is very important, like addressing causes of displacements of migration, addressing both slow and sudden onset disasters. For that matter, our disaster management ministry is quite active, and they have been taking various measures, especially in the coastal areas, developing their capacity so that they do not face these things. Then relocation within the country. As I have told you, that a huge number of people are living in the coastal area, and more so, of course, being a very fertile country. Historically, people started living in these areas, and so the population is also quite big. It is not possible to contain so many people taken from the coastal area to relocate, to get them relocated in other areas. So that will be a big problem if we really have such displacements. Ensuring economic well-being of the trapped and most vulnerable groups who are facing waterlogging, who are facing loss of agricultural land. That is a big issue. That's something needs to be done for these people who are in the risky hotspots. Societal safety nets are required to be developed, and then adequate support services for the vulnerable groups, especially women, children, indigenous people, and disabled people. For them, special provisions are required to be taken. Ensuring human rights-based protection for climate migrants and securing fundamental human rights for the climate-induced migrants. That is something very important. And if we cannot really do, it is definitely an injustice done to people who are living over there. Entire community migration, social provision for the sinking islands, nations. For them, in fact, special measures are required to be taken. I can cite the example of Kiribati and some other islands over there who face serious trouble. From small islands, they gather to the main island, and they create that kind of situation where it is difficult to contain so many people over there. Now that UNFCCC developing countries, in the UNFCCC purview, developing countries, particularly vulnerable developing countries like LDCs and SIDS, could take necessary initiative to address the climate change induced displacement issues. And Warsaw International Mechanism, it has already been discussed by Harjeet and also by Ajay. And I feel that that also required to take specific steps so that we can face all these things. Ultimately, I want to say, ladies and gentlemen, that while temperature is rising, we wouldn't be able to cope with the situation that is going to, the adverse impact is when adverse impact is going to rise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. At this point, since we have a few speakers still, we'd like to just for a very short period of time, open the floor for some clarificatory questions or comments. So we have about 5 minutes. So maybe we can ask a couple of colleagues who from the floor would like to either raise some questions or comments, and we can ask the panel to respond quickly. Yes, I see several hands. I will call one woman and one man. So the gentleman here in front raised his hand first, and the women. Yes, I can. please speak after, right after. So the mic.
Shai, take the microphone.
Thank you. I'm Chris Roman from Bangladesh. I actually like to know that how do you use the words migration and displacement? Do you use interchangeably? Because the connotation around these two words are different. So sometimes in one presentation you say climate-induced migration, and the next sentence you say climate-induced displacement. So it sounds a bit, clumsy, not very clear. So if you just explain and clarify, that would be useful. Thank you.
Actually, sir, to complicate it further, we use 3 words. Actually, there's climate refugees, climate migrants, and then climate-induced displaced communities and people. So it would be an interesting response from our panel, but there is a reason why all these 3 different words are being used.
Nina can answer.
Yeah, but we'll take the second question first so that the responses can be all in one go. Yes?
Great, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists for the presentations. My question, my name is Meredith and I'm coming from the International Labour Organization. So my question is brief. You all touched on displacement, migration, whatever word we attribute to it. I'm wondering, especially with the Action Aid study, these migrants are leaving because their livelihoods are compromised, and a lot of the sectors, agriculture, but they're also going to places. What sectors are they filling? Are they going into the informal economy for the large part? And what effects is then that having on the host community is kind of my point of clarification. Thank you very much.
Okay, on the first question, Nina would like to respond, and I guess some other members of the panel can also give a response. Nina?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think in some parts of the world, we say that their child have many names. But I think it's important also, as you underline, migration and displacement is usually not the same, because displacement is something that is forced, it's not free will, but you are forced into it. And I think when we talk in this context, we have people who are displaced within their own countries, and we have people who are displaced outside their countries. And when people are displaced outside their countries, I think very much we should try to avoid to use the term climate refugee. I know it's a popular term in media, but I think when we talk about policy work like the UNFCCC process and others, we should not use it. And the reason for that is that the word refugee has a convention, which is very specific what it covers. And one of the key words in the UN Refugee Convention is persecution. And when we talk about people being displaced in the context of climate change, it's not persecution. We also think that when we talk policy, it's not just about words, it's about action and improving the lives of people. And I hear that many people say it's good to get a convention on this, and I don't disagree with that, but we need something that happens now. And if you wait to get a new convention covering these issues, it will take many years. Some people say, oh, but you can open up the Refugee Convention. I would say, no, no, no. And the reason for that is that if you started to renegotiate that now, you would end up with something which is even worse for those who are protected by it. And I don't think we will get something for many, many decades, and we need action now. So let's focus on policy that gives answers. Long response, but I think also in the UNFCCC, there are 3 words. It's migration, it's displacement, and planned relocation with the umbrella term human mobility.
Yeah, this is actually a very interesting debate that's going on among different civil society groups. That's one view. There are also other views that where climate refugees is a term that is used. So Sanjay is also giving his own views on this. Or is it Harjeet? So just keep it short.
I just wanted to say on migration, because when Nina, you said we should not look at migration just from the loss and damage perspective. Yeah, displacement, loss and damage perspective, but migration, some people define it as adaptation strategy as well. But we need to further interrogate whether it's a safe migration or an unsafe migration or a forced migration, and how does that play into that. So there are terminologies which we need to question, because our response would vary accordingly.
Well, before I answer this question about where in which sector they are moving from when their livelihoods are affected, let me also acknowledge the presence of our lead researcher, Teresa, who has been working on this study. So, and she can also put some light on after my response. Basically, when we talk about, most of the migration is because of push factor rather than pull factor, and that makes even skilled people unskilled when they migrate, and most of them are migrating in the labor sector, which is very unsafe, very low labor standards, and they are also migrating to landless agriculture labor. I hope that answers.
Yes, actually, that also takes care of the second question. So perhaps that was a good, I think, stimulus for further discussion. We will now move on to asking the rest of our speakers to give their thoughts, especially as they are from important agencies that can facilitate and provide responses to the issues that have been raised, whatever term that we choose, or actually the fact that there are different terms mean there are many different dimensions to the whole problem of displacement. I'm going to ask now a colleague from the platform on disaster displacement, Atlas Solberg. He's the head of the coordination unit. It's a follow-up mechanism to the Nansen Initiative, which he will also tell us about. Just briefly.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon. My name is Solberg. I work for a state-led initiative, which is called the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And I would use this opportunity to also recognize the presence of Secretary from the Ministry of Environment, Bangladesh. Bangladesh is co-chair or vice chair of Platform on Disaster Displacement, which is led currently by Germany. I have three quick points, picking up a little on 4 previous speakers, and then I will end up some of the policy recommendation that the Platform on Disaster Displacement has or is promoting. One thing it is clearly from this discussion is that displacement dynamics or human mobility dynamics in the context of climate change is a real issue. We see that in very, very many places, and that is also our findings. And clearly some countries and some people are more vulnerable than others, and least developed countries, small and in developing states, are particularly exposed to the adverse effect of climate change. But we also have heard from the presentations that there are many factors at play. It's not only climate change. We can clearly see that climate change is a risk multiplier or amplifier, but we have been talking about overgrazing, which is environmental degradation. There has been talk about development projects, lack of opportunities. So in that context, we should be very careful to frame this exclusively as a climate change issue. And the reason or the risk of framing it too narrowly is that we lose out on other options to address them, the development agenda, the economic agenda, and other tools. So we should look into a toolbox of policy options on how to address it. There's clearly a role to play for the Framework Convention on Climate Change, but there's also clearly a role to play for others. So that's one message. A second is what some of the presenters have talked about, putting people at the center. And there was use of spotlight on protection, and we fully agree with that. If you base this as a human rights issue, right to life, right to have a decent standard of living or adequate standard of housing, then we can build a policy option, put it as a human rights issue, and then we have a set of other tools that we can invoke, for example, in internationally recognized human rights instruments. A third comment is around policy options beyond the Climate Change Convention. Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is clearly a key tool that can reduce the risk at community level. We have recently finalized a World Humanitarian Summit where there are commitment to reduce in half the number of people displaced the next 10 or 15 years. So let's work on that commitment from states to reduce displacement through some of these commitments. And there's also a process, and I think any conversation around climate refugees or people moving across border has to pay very close attention to the New York Declaration on Migrants and Refugees. There will be a process to develop a compact for safe, orderly, and legal migration, a compact for refugees the next 2 years. It will be co-facilitated by Switzerland and and Mexico, who is in charge, at least for the modalities of this process. And these are a process where climate change knowledge, which I heard today, should be included clearly. The Nansen Initiative, and I have no time to go deeply into that, looked into the possibility to have a guiding framework for those that are displaced across international border that do not fall within the scope of the Refugee Convention. So there is a conversation around how can we cover those that do not have international protection at the moment. And I think I agree with the speaker from NRC on to be some prudence around using the concept of climate refugee. There is already a convention covering those people qualifying these criteria. There's also a problem of attribution, and that brings back to my first point. What if you cannot solely establish that climate change is the key driver? What if it is a multi-factor or a multi-causal phenomenon? And then we may run into an attribution challenge around that concept. And we should also understand that if people cross borders due to climate change or disaster in the context of it, there's a very different relationship between that individual and the state of origin. It is not a bond that has been broken because of persecution or violence. It is particularly a bond that is intact between that citizen and the state. So we need a very different cooperative framework to deal with these challenges, rather than putting it in as a refugee concept and where the persecution element is central. So the protection agenda of the Nansen Initiative and the Platform on Disaster Displacement have looked into, in the absence of wording on this in international law, what can be done or what are states doing. And there's a set of opportunities within migration legislation. There's a set of opportunities within freedom of movement mechanism at regional level. There's even some opportunities in regional refugee protection frameworks in Africa and in the Americas. There's a broader definition of who's a refugee. It's not solely based on persecution. It's also based on breakdown of social order. So there's a set of policy options that is already being used by states, and we may try to strengthen them while the other conversations are going on. So thank you, Madam Chair, for these moments you're giving me. Thank you.
Thank you. We are losing time. We only have 15 minutes left. We have a couple of other speakers that's also very important to hear from. Our next speaker, whom we'd like to thank for coming, because it was a kind of just a short notice for him. So we have Mr. Benjamin Schachter of he's the Human Rights Officer on Climate Change and Environment from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Thank you, Liddy. And I actually, maybe I'll step up here just so I can see the screen. It is a pleasure to join you today on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The most powerful message I've heard today is that climate change is hurting people now, and it's hurting them substantially. And the international community is not doing enough. We know this. We're living in an age of mobility. Some 250 million women, men, and children are not living in their own country. Some people, an estimated 22.5 million per year, are moving because of the risk posed by sudden onset extreme weather events like hurricanes and slow onset weather events, climate-related events such as coastal erosion, salinization, sea level rise, land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, and desertification. These movements have human rights implications. Understanding these implications is one of the most complex and pressing issues currently facing the international community. Threats faced by those moving as a result of adverse climate impacts are substantial and may be further exacerbated for persons belonging to particular groups, including minorities, indigenous peoples, women, children, persons with disabilities, and the poor. The legal and policy regime for protecting the rights of persons on the move owing to the adverse effects of climate change must be clarified in order to adequately address the substantial human rights threats they face. Security, lack of access to clean water, healthcare, and basic social services, inability to sustain decent livelihoods, persecution, and discrimination. Not all cross-border movement falls neatly into categories of voluntary or forced. As we've heard today in the questions about what is a refugee, what is a migrant, what is a displaced person, these categories really no longer work to protect the rights of people who are moving for a variety of reasons. The slowly unfolding pace of weather-related disasters means that some people might choose to move now before they're forced to move later. This movement may not be entirely voluntary, and it places those moving in vulnerable situations. Regardless of the reasons that people move, we must remember that the rights of all persons are entitled to protection by states, and that all persons are entitled to lead lives of human dignity. Climate change and related movement of people threatens these rights, and it must be addressed. We need an approach to climate-related movements and all human movements that goes beyond protection from immediate physical threats and looks in addition at the underlying socioeconomic and political context related to poverty and weak governance, and the ways in which structural discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion operate to render certain individuals and communities at greater risk of precarious, non-voluntary migration and displacement in the context of climate change. This will require more hard work. In October this year, OHCHR hosted a two-day meeting on human rights and climate change. The meeting included a half-day panel on human rights, migration, and displacement. I'd like to share with you some of the recommendations from this discussion. Address the root causes of forced displacement by strengthening social protection systems, empowering persons in vulnerable situations, and investing in productive, inclusive, and resilient development in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and aquaculture. Clarify the relationship between climate change and movements of people and the corresponding obligations of states. Address collective displacement and associated human rights harms. Establish mechanisms for impacted people to participate in relevant decision-making, including in discussions at the UNFCCC. Emphasize the importance of preemption through appropriate disaster risk reduction and adaptation, including by taking effective climate change mitigation actions, resilience of livelihoods and food systems. In the context of climate, the Paris Agreement specifically references the rights of migrants and calls for all states to respect, promote, and consider human rights when taking climate action. It also calls for the Warsaw Mechanism to address these issues. OHCHR would welcome the task force of the Warsaw Mechanism to consider human rights and the recommendations of OHCHR's recent expert meeting and its deliberations. Further, we believe it is critical that the task force includes somebody with human rights expertise. We will continue to advocate the protection of the rights of all persons on the move, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this event.
Thank you, Ben. And it's also very important to hear from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they actually have a climate change and disaster displacement officer. So that is within the world of the issue of refugees, climate change, and disaster displacement is also being addressed. So we'd like to call on Marine Frank, who is the officer.
All set.
There, okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, and sorry for being last of speakers, and I hope you're still awake and interested to hear what we have to say in the very intense days here. This issue is a huge challenge for UNHCR. Climate change is a vulnerability enhancer. It pushes more and more people to move, and these people are in need for protection and assistance. Also, climate change sows seeds for conflict and acts as a threat multiplier in many of today's conflicts, from Darfur to Somalia, Iraq and Syria, and others. It also makes displacement much worse for people already on the move, refugees, asylum seekers, and others. We have made a big step forward with the Paris Agreement and the task force to avert, minimize, and address climate change-related displacement. This is really a milestone in terms of global commitment to take action on this issue. And here are a series of recommendations for consideration on what we can do that would help move further this issue. First, avert minimizing means national preparedness and enhancing resilience of vulnerable population. This is about community-based resilience. It is essential to involve hazard-prone communities. From prevention and response planning, inclusiveness can help prevent further exacerbation of vulnerabilities and impoverishment. In this context of the UNFCCC, there are tools to adapt and to plan its national adaptation plans, its NDCs. These are tools where UNHCR would recommend mainstreaming human mobility issues. The Cancun adaptation framework also mentions plan relocation. Plan relocation can be used in anticipation of a disaster. It's a complex process that needs resource coordination and above all, the extensive consultation of affected communities, host communities, but also communities on the move. It has to be used as a measure of last resort when there is robust evidence of a lack of alternative, and it has to be accomplished with a rights-based framework. UNHCR has developed some preliminary guidance with Georgetown University and Brookings on how to engage in this kind of process. Most displacement in the context of climate change will be internal displacement within the same country, but in some cases people cross the borders, and in that case there is no convention that protect them. Why don't we use climate refugees? I think this has been explained already, but also because if you use climate refugees terminology, it sends a wrong signal that these people might be protected by the Refugee Convention, and they are not. There is no convention protecting people displaced in the context of climate change. So, and there is no UN institution with a clear mandate to assist and protect these people. So that's why we are not using this terminology to really address that gap properly. Addressing climate change related displacement requires broad-based partnership, in particular that those that bridge the gap between humanitarian development action, but also institutional blockage and silos at national and international level need to be overcome. In particular, national environment authorities not seeing migration as part of their portfolio and vice versa. While legal gap exists when it comes to cross-border displacement in the context of climate change, this should not be an impediment to action. There is evidence of states' practice of admitting disaster-displaced persons through free movement protocols, humanitarian visa, temporary protection, etc. The Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda gathers all these examples of best practices to protect people in cross-border disaster contexts. The challenge is to harmonize at the regional level and ensure a more consistent and regular use of these tools. There is also a need for further resources and commitment for the international community to support disaster-prone states. UNHCR encourages the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund to take into consideration these, the recommendations from the task force that the task force will elaborate to avert, minimize, and address displacement so that it's not only recommendations that are drafted on a paper, but that they are actually implemented. It's late and I wanted to be brief, so thanks again for the opportunity of UNHCR to speak at this panel and for your attention.
Thank you, Marine. We all know that the presentations were really short and we don't have much time for question and answer. I'd just like to say that let's an appetizer. We hope you will continue to be interested. And now we have time for maybe 2 questions at the most, which some of the panel will address. So Assad, and I will take a woman this time, a woman and a man, unless there's no questions from women. Women first. If not, yes, at the back, yeah. Assad, please go ahead.
So, Assad from Friends of the Earth. There's, of course, two aspects to this, both the technical, and I was interested in the terminology debate, of course, from a technical point of view. But I wanted to bring it much more to a political frame. As we know, climate change is a problem of the global commons, and everybody must do their fair bit, and that's clearly not happening. And we know that sacrifice zones are being created as we breach 1.5, potentially on our way to 3.3 or 3.5 degrees. So I'm interested in what you think is how we build that global push for support and legal protection for climate migrants or climate refugees, particularly in the global north, where we see hostility, racism, and xenophobia on existing small patterns of migration. And of course, Donald Trump talking about walls, but the European Union itself building fences around the European Union. So what was how do you build this political support to get where we want to?
Okay, the next question.
Nimo Bassi, All Wash International. Well, Assad has asked part of the question I wanted to ask about political wars and physical wars about to come up in the world. But my question now is, this issue is very urgent, and we do know that it's driven by global warming, and global warming is driven by the burning of fossil fuels. The Paris Agreement doesn't address this issue, this fundamental issue at all, about how to stop burning fossil fuels. So I would like to hear from the government official representative on the panel, how come science tells us that we have to stop burning fossil fuels if we have to stand a chance of avoiding catastrophic global warming, and yet the Paris Agreement and the negotiation is not addressing this issue at all?
Okay, so we'd like to hear from our panel. The first question was about what are our ideas for what could be global protection for whether you call them climate refugees, climate migrants. I think the point was precisely that there is no, I think Maureen mentioned this, there is no existing convention to address the protection and the issues and the needs of those who were forced because of climate change. They were displaced or they were forcibly migrated and or might be called actually refugees as well. So that's one. And the other one is the question of addressed to government. And we have one government here. So maybe I'd like to ask him first. The question raised by Nemo.
I think if I've understood, he has said about whether the global warming, the emission reduction, whether any action or sorry, any initiative has been taken or not. If I have understood that, isn't that?
Would you like to reiterate?
You mean, okay, stop burning fossil fuel. That's what is in fact looked after by putting a cap. That's what we are talking about, maintaining well below 2 degrees Celsius, or it is of course 1.5 degree if possible. And for that matter, INDCs have been submitted. Now after the ratification, INDCs have become NDCs. So for that way, fossil fuel burning should be reduced, isn't it? And the governments will definitely take initiative for that. Our government and many governments have submitted INDC. And now that, well, 100, so far 103 countries have already ratified. All of them now agree to that. So they are now going to follow NDC, not INDC. Does that answer your question? Because from our side, I can say that from the government of Bangladesh, we submitted in our INDC 5% condition, non-conditional, and 15% conditional reduction of emission. Contribute to emission, but in our country, we have made a commitment for that, and we want that countries which are really emitters, they should also make similar commitments, and they should also make it possible so that the present INDC, which says that it is about 2.7 degree Celsius, even if the INDCs are, implemented. So if we can take a higher or ambitious program for reduction of emission, reduction of use of fossil fuel, at that time it will definitely come down. Now we are looking forward to that particular implementation, which is going to be looked after by this, this COP and CMA in future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Marlene?
Yes, so very quickly on the difficult, extremely difficult indeed, political context in Europe, and also we cannot ignore yesterday's election. On the one hand, we have more and more countries closing their frontiers, and on the other hand, what we are saying is that we are more and more people on the move. How do we solve this? In my point of view, calling for a new convention, international convention, is not the most helpful because it will take long and will not necessarily have the political support. But it also raises a question of will state implement this convention if we... On the other hand, we had these last years the Nansen Initiative, a bottom-up process, state-led, that came out with a protection agenda that gathers effective practices of protection. And this was endorsed by a lot of states, 110, I think. So, so there is really a political will to address this, and the fact that this issue is addressed also in the Paris Agreement is also a signal that there is appetite at the political level to address this issue. So the question is more, how do we implement the protection agenda? How do we make sure that these effective practices are broadened and are applicable to all the people that are on the move? Another policy process that is happening now is we had in New York in September the New York summit on refugees and migrants. Will be global compacts on refugees and migrants trying to address the whole issue of migration, not only climate change, but climate change is mentioned many times in the New York Declaration. So there are some ways to address it, big challenge, but I think we all need to work together through the same objective. It will require a lot of cooperation among all stakeholders.
Okay, Benjamin?
Yeah, I'd just like to second part of that, which is I don't think what we need is a new agreement. We need to ensure that existing human rights commitments and other commitments are fulfilled in the context of climate-related movement of persons. And we have a framework that we can apply, and we have a lot of existing commitments that we can apply. And often the problem is that we have a situation where these commitments aren't being fulfilled. In the context of sort of working further within existing processes in this area, OHCHR is contributing to the development of a global compact on safe, regular, and orderly migration within the framework of an intergovernmental conference, which will be held in 2018. This is the process that Maureen just mentioned. We're also contributing to state-led processes to develop guidelines on vulnerable migrants, potentially based on a set of principles and guidelines on the human rights protection of migrants in vulnerable situations within large and or mixed movements. And we're doing this within the context of the Global Migration Group as well. So I think there are existing processes ongoing that can contribute in this area.
Yes, I'd like to thank our speakers, also our Dr. Kamal, the secretary, because he needs to leave and he has a meeting, and now we're also going a bit over time. I think it's been very interesting. Let's treat this as a part of the beginning of a very important pursuit of not just clarifying terms and looking at whatever possible options, but actually actively pursuing urgent action to address this issue. So we hope we will stay in touch with you, and that we will be pursuing together, and including the debates and conversations we need to have to clarify terms and policy options and the like. Thank you very much in behalf of the organizations. I think there's another group that will be using the room. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Nina. It was good. actually. We had a lot of speakers, but we managed. Cheers.